All right, kids, sit down, buckle up. It's time to go through two of the cycles very, very quickly. As I've explained in class, we are not going to spend a ton of time on the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. I am making an executive decision here. I know that we get way more questions about the water cycle, and I'm actually struggling to find where the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle are supposed to fall in to this, but I don't want to do a disservice and not go over them. I'm just not going to dig as deep into them this year as I have in the past. First and foremost, I have no idea what this is. I don't know what that is. Everyone's been asking that. It's not some weird symbol. It's not a secret code. I don't know what it is. I would go back in and delete it out of Nearpod, but that would invalidate all of your codes. And that would make a lot of this pointless and put a lot of extra work on all of us. Just know that I'll delete that later. We are going to look at three cycles: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and we're going to spend a giant amount of time on the water cycle this year. I think I teach it 5 times throughout the year. It comes up a lot. Obviously, it's going to come up during weather. It's going to come up during the changes of matter. It's going to come up during ecosystems. It's going to come up during heat exchange. So we're going to go over this a lot. And that's fine because it shows up a lot at the end of the year, and it's something that you definitely need to have a full grasp of before we move on. And you've already been taught it a little bit in 3rd grade. So let's move forward. The nitrogen cycle. Now, again, just like we were talking about when we were looking at our vocabulary words, understanding that the nitrogen cycle, if you were to really boil it down into its basic bits, is the recycling of nitrogen in an ecosystem. Okay? You need to understand that nitrogen is it's an element that's important to all living things. Plants and animals need it. It helps us to grow. And we're going to show how the nitrogen is moved throughout the different parts of the ecosystem and throughout the atmosphere. Again, all living things need nitrogen. It's in the air. We breathe it in. We just can't use it in that fashion. We actually breathe it in and then breathe it back out. Don't feel bad. Plants can't do it either. We need something that breaks things down into useful parts. You might see that little thinking emoji down there. We have something in the environment, in the ecosystems, that breaks things down. We've typically said it breaks down dead things, but it also breaks down other things as well. And if you're thinking decomposers or even bacteria, you are correct. Bacteria does it. Nitrogen moves from the air and it gets into the dirt, into the soil. It gets there from the rain. It gets there from lightning strikes. If something dies and it's decomposed, nitrogen is one of those things that is broken down. It gets there when an animal poops, and that is broken down. And some of it just moves from the air into the soil. Once it's there, you would be like, oh, cool, it moves into the plants. Nah, it's not quite so. And you'll watch a video that gets a little deeper than I'm going to. Bacteria breaks the nitrogen down. And it breaks it into nitrites, which still aren't usable, which is kind of sad. It breaks it into ammonia and then nitrites. Still can't use it. And then it breaks that down into nitrates. So from ammonia to nitrites to nitrates. No, that's not on the test, so don't stress it. Finally, something that the plants can use, and shockingly, this is called nitrification, right? Nitrogen cycle, nitrification. Pretty sure we can remember that. So now we finally have a form of nitrogen that plants can use. So they absorb the nitrates through their roots, and they're able to get nitrogen inside of them. Now, we all know that once nitrogen is in the plants are able to use it. But how does that nitrogen get into, let's even say, me or into another animal? Well, from one of two ways. I can either eat a plant, which is fantastic. I get the nitrogen from the plant that way. That's already been broken down by the bacteria for the plant to use. Now I can use it. Or I can eat something that eats plants. Look at this bear over here. He's munching on a fish. That fish had been eating, let's just pretend that fish had been eating other plants as its main source of food. And so the bear is getting it that way. And again, it can move down the food chain that way. And so we're getting nitrogen through the way that we're able to eat things. Eventually, like that bear, that deer, they die. And when things die, we've already talked about this, plants or animals, decomposers break them down. Part of what they're releasing, when I say they're making good soil, part of what they're breaking down and releasing from the dead things is the nitrogen that's stored inside of them. The nitrogen's back in the soil, and that kind of starts it all over again. That really is a super basic way to look at the nitrogen cycle. We can move some nitrogen around when we're doing some of the different fertilizers, and that gets nitrogen into different places. We have nitrogen that's in the water and aquifers underground, and it makes its way to the soil. So there's a few other ways, but just understand that the nitrogen cycle is just the recycling of nitrogen from the atmosphere into the ground, through the plants, into animals. When those things die and decompose, bacteria break it back down into the soil. And then if it's just nitrogen, we have to go through that process of nitrification so we can break it all the way down into nitrates so that the plants can use it, and the process just starts all over again. To get a good cartoony version of that, I have a good link to Study Jams here. I suggest you watch it. I'll probably watch it while I'm teaching in class, but for those of you at home Monday, Tuesday, you're going to miss it. I'm not going to go back and watch this. Those folks that are here, they get to watch the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle at school, but they're going to miss the water cycle videos that they'll have to watch at home. Moving on. Told you I'm not spending a lot of time on these. Carbon cycle. Well, if the nitrogen cycle is the continuous movement of nitrogen throughout the atmosphere, carbon cycle is the continuous movement of carbon through living things. Again, carbon is pretty much everywhere. We'll talk about in a few minutes that it's the building blocks of everything, but we need to talk about the greenhouse effect. Typically, when I say the greenhouse effect, most people think that that's a bad thing, but it is not necessarily a bad thing. Some of the gases in our atmosphere, which we will get to when we're talking about the layers of the atmosphere, trap some of the heat from the sun. This is a good thing. If it didn't trap the heat, we'd all freeze to death. And that keeps the earth at a good temperature to keep it warm enough to support all the life, plant life, animal life, and those types of things. So we need some of those gases in the air to trap that heat. Carbon dioxide in plants. Plants use carbon dioxide. They breathe that in, and then they breathe out oxygen. I have breathe in parentheses because plants don't have lungs, so they're not really respirating the way we do, but we're going to pretend that that's what it is because it makes it a little bit more easy for us to understand. So they're taking in carbon dioxide. They're releasing oxygen. You and I, on the other hand, are breathing in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. So we're kind of giving each other what we need, and that's one of the reasons why we talk about ecosystems and why plants are so important to us, because they are releasing what we need and we are releasing what they need, and it's kind of a give and take system that we have going on there. Carbon has been called the universal building block for life. It's like the greatest Lego in the world. You can add just about almost anything to it. It does have a very unique ability to form bonds with itself. It has the ability to form bonds with many other elements. A lot of elements don't have the ability to do what carbon does in the way that it's able to bond with so many other things. It is in and it makes up just about everything. So you can't find a Lego set in the world that doesn't have Legos in it. That's just not possible. They're the building blocks. They are the Legos. Carbon is kind of like that. Carbon is like the building block that you have to have for most things. Okay, of course there are other things that don't have carbon, but it really is an extremely important element. We know how carbon moves from the atmosphere to plants. We talked about that. Plants take in carbon dioxide. Don't forget, carbon is in everything as well. When things die, there we go, back to those decomposers. I told you this would get a little bit more complicated. Decomposers break things down into their basic elements, and they release those back into the atmosphere. When decomposers are breaking down a dead plant or animal, they're releasing nitrogen, they're releasing carbon, they're breaking it down and returning it all to the soil, into the atmosphere. Again, some of that carbon goes in the air, some of that carbon gets stored in the ground. If carbon is stored underground for a long, long time, like deep in the earth, it can turn into oil and it can turn into coal. You and I know that we use oil and coal in plants. Like, not when I say a plant, I mean like an operating plant, like a power plant, like Duke Power. Or it's used in the oil form when we make gas to power our cars. When we're burning that gas, when we're burning that coal in like the Duke Power plants, we are releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So power plants, cars are releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. And you think, well, plants need carbon dioxide, not a problem, right? Not necessarily. Some scientists say that we're releasing too much carbon into the atmosphere. That is not being used And you can look at the deforestation and the taking down of too many forests. So maybe with the carbon that we're releasing would have been used, but we've also been removing the trees and plants that would have needed it. So there's like extra carbon. Well, what happens with this extra carbon? Well, I've already told you that in the upper layers of the atmosphere, there are molecules of things that trap the heat from the sun. Some scientists would say that this extra carbon is causing the greenhouse effect to be even stronger, which would be what we would consider global warming. Some scientists disagree with that. We're not going to get into that right now about the agreeing or disagreeing of that. We just know that it happens when we burn oil and when we burn coal. Here's another fantastic video for you to watch very quickly on the carbon cycle, and that's it. Like about 5 minutes on each. I'm not digging too deep. I went through like the 285 questions on SchoolNet. Couldn't even find a question on the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle. I would have to make it up. And if I did, it would basically be the definition. What is nitrogen cycle? It's the recycling of nitrogen through the atmosphere. What's the carbon cycle? The recycling of carbon throughout the ecosystem. Don't stress these, but I certainly don't want to skip them. My luck, if I skip them, there'd be 45 questions later on the benchmark, and then I would look like a fool. We're going to take a look at that, and I'm going to talk to some of the people at county office. I'm going to see, like, do we need to teach the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle? Is that something we can kind of put on the back burner? And if we get to it, awesome. If we don't, it's not really going to hurt the kids in any way, because that's definitely not my goal. I don't want to hurt the kids in any way as far as their learning goes, but I also want to be able to teach things at a deeper level if I have more time. If I can get rid of this, I would have more time for the water cycle, which I would most definitely love. Anyway, that's it. Don't forget, smash that like button and subscribe, and let's rock on with the water cycle.